the Harlem Renaissance. To understand the Harlem Renaissance, you obviously have to understand the Great Migration. Harlem prior to 1910 was not predominantly an African-American neighborhood. In fact, during the Great Migration, before 1910, 90% of African-Americans lived in the American South. That changes dramatically during the course of the Great Migration. In the context of New York City, it is Harlem, which is the area that many African-Americans move to. The reason why many of them move to Harlem is largely because it is one of the few areas that does not discriminate against African-American housing, either in African-American purchasing housing or renting. So Harlem, which before the 19-teens had been very much a diverse ethnic neighborhood in various guises. Jews, the Dutch in the past had lived in Harlem. It gets its name from the Dutch. But by 1910 and afterwards, you start to see large numbers of African Americans, many of whom have recently arrived from the South with their families, who are coming to this area in northern Manhattan in New York City. And the Harlem Renaissance refers to a sort of flourishing of a distinctly African-American music, literature, and art that is performed and created by African Americans. It is a flourishing of pride also among African Americans in art forms which they are actually celebrating and are actually getting not only critical acclaim, but they are also making money selling their art in Harlem. It becomes a very large phenomena in the wider world, and many white consumers are consuming African-American art from Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s. So why Harlem? We answered that. It's basically because it's one of the few places that does not discriminate, that's not discriminate against African Americans. And early on in the Harlem Renaissance, if we try to go towards sort of one of the philosophical aspects of the Harlem Renaissance, it came to the problem of language, and there's a famous debate between a African-American newspaper editor named George Schuyler and Langston Hughes about what should African-American art be like. And this kind of goes straight to one of the core sort of debates that the African-American community was having within itself in this period of time. George Schuyler had written a piece saying that African Americans should try to create an art that tried to emulate some of the finest art of the time, that used that sort of matched art of the past that was already celebrated in the United States, such as not only European art forms, but that in some way African American art should try to stay away from use of African American dialect, a celebration of sort of African Americans in the South, for instance, that it should instead be an art that took pride in showing the world what African Americans could do. Well, Langston Hughes, that was George Schuyler's perspective. Langston Hughes responded to this sort of interpretation of what Black art should be by saying absolutely not, that African Americans should use their own language. They should use their own ways of speaking, their own ways of communication. And because just like any people is going to communicate in their own vernacular, they're going to communicate in their own way of communication, there's no reason why African Americans should try to become American. African Americans should be African American and be proud of those art forms that they had already created, whether those art forms were popular or not. Langston Hughes was very fond of, say, taking jazz or blues, which were already largely established African-American art forms, and using those as the basis for the language of Langston Hughes's poetry, for example. Here's a map of Harlem. We'll get back to that debate in a second, but here's a map of Harlem in 1930 by James Weldon Johnson. You can see the growth, he calls it Negro Harlem, from 1925 to 1930, of the massive numbers of African Americans that kind of started to inhabit this region in northern Manhattan. James Weldon Johnson was a famous artist of the Harlem Renaissance himself. Langston Hughes wrote in this response to George Schuyler, in which George Schuyler, advocates for the sort of emulation of other art forms instead of staying away from sort of what Schuyler would sort of describe as sort of these base forms of African American language, etc. Langston Hughes says, one of the most promising of the young Negro poets said to me once, this is the beginning of his essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, I want to be a poet, not a Negro poet, meaning I believe I want to write like a white poet, meaning subconsciously I would like to be a white poet, meaning behind that I would like to be white. And I was sorry the young man said that, for no great poet has ever been afraid of being himself. And I doubted then that, with his desire to run away spiritually from his race, this boy would ever be a great poet. But this is the mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America, this urge within the race toward whiteness, the desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standardization, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. At the end of his essay, he writes, we younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful, and ugly too. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. Hughes's essay would actually be kind of a watershed in the Harlem Renaissance, because as many of these artists and singers and musicians and poets, etc., start to find their own language to not only communicate with themselves, but communicate with the larger American audience, they find that it is within their, or at least the Langston Hughes's perspective, that from the art that comes from their true self is the art that should be expressed, and all else, to a certain extent, be damned. Here, for instance, is a Langston Hughes poem, one of his most famous. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Here's a poem by Claude Mckay. Many of Harlem Renaissance poetry and art reflected what W.B. Du Bois, who was a sociologist who was also part of the Harlem Renaissance, would call double consciousness, that feeling of looking through the eyes of America as an American, but also looking through the eyes of this dominant culture that in many ways discriminated against and talked down African American art. And so this form of double consciousness, I think we can see a little bit of this in Claude Mckay's poem, White Houses. Your door is shut against my tightened face, and I am sharp as steel with discontent. But I possess the courage and the grace to bear my anger proudly and unbent. The pavement slabs burn loose beneath my feet, a chafing savage down the decent street. And passion rends my vitals as I pass, where boldly shines your shuttered door of glass. Oh, I must search for wisdom every hour, deep in my wrathful bosom sore and raw, and find in it the superhuman power to hold me to the letter of your law. Oh, I must keep my heart inviolate against the potent poison of your hate. And the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance, as expressed in Mckay's poem and also Hughes' poem and in the poetry of dozens of other African-American artists of the time, is not the only expression. The Harlem Renaissance is really all forms of art. All art forms are really present in this. Certainly music in terms of jazz, and we showed you the picture earlier of Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong, and also figures like Duke Ellington, who are playing to huge crowds in Harlem at this time. And then you have artists, visual artists such as Aaron Douglas, who drew the illustrations for James Weldon Johnson's famous book, God's Trombones. You can see this sort of mixture of you can see sort of a hearkening to African American art forms. Certainly, you see here this vision of the slave and slave ships, and making this sort of central to not only the African American experience, but making African American art central to the American experience itself. Here we have James Weldon Johnson speaking about Black Manhattan. I showed you the map before. So here we have Harlem, not merely a colony or a community or a settlement, but a Black city, located in the heart of white Manhattan, containing more Negroes to the square mile than any other spot on earth. It strikes the uninformed observer as a phenomenon, a miracle straight out of the skies. It is not a fringe, it is not a slum, nor is it a quarter consisting of dilapidated tenements. It is a section of new law apartment houses and handsome dwellings, with streets as well paved, as well lighted, and as well kept as in any other part of the city. And I think the legacy of the Harlem Renaissance, this explosion of art and artistic expression among African Americans in northern cities, sort of a byproduct of the Great Migration. Going forward, to see what the effect of that period is that this proliferation of African American musicians, authors, artists would only increase in the decades afterwards. This was not a moment in the 1920s in Harlem. Certainly with the Great Depression and with the attendant economic collapse of the United States in the Great Depression, many of these opportunities for African American artists dried up to a certain extent, but they did not go away. And you find after this a real transformation of American culture itself. Jazz and blues and other African American art forms start to become really part and parcel of American society, not separable from American society, but American cultural forms themselves. They become central to it. And it's no longer a culture of what would often occur before the Great Migration and before the Harlem Renaissance. You often had whites appropriating Black art forms and then becoming famous by them. You have individuals like Scott Joplin, the entire musical form of ragtime. Much of this was Black art forms that had kind of been taken by white artists who had the opportunity to publish them and to become famous from them, who are kind of making money off of Black art forms, and Black artists who don't have the opportunity to make their own art and sell it. Now, this still went on and still goes on today. Certainly Elvis, for instance, one of the probably the most famous recording artists of the 1950s, pretty much gets all of his moves, all of his dance moves, and his entire sort of persona and way of thinking from Black art forms. But you do have after this a culture, African American culture, becomes one of the most popular cultural exports around the world from the United States. I'm reminded of even during the days of the Soviet Union, when it's very difficult to get, for instance, American products inside the Soviet Union. One of the most popular forms of music in the Soviet Union is African American jazz. That would be true in France. That's going to be true all over the world. And you find coming out of the Harlem Renaissance a kind of a flowering that never stops. When you look at music today in the United States, to think of popular music today as being at all separable from African American music, there is no separation. And that is certainly true not only of music, but of really all other forms of art in America today, that it's not African American art. This is really at the core of what it means to be American, is to grow up and to be infused with African American culture and art, no matter what one's background